Welcome to Behavior as Communication in the Online Classroom. This webinar is part of the webinar series by the Albuquerque Public Schools Behavior Support Specialists team. Our webinar series focuses on different aspects of behavior and provides strategies and support for teachers so they can address behavior in this new virtual setting. Before we begin, I want to extend a sincere thank you to all of the educators out there who are going above and beyond and working tirelessly to support all of their learners in this new, challenging, sometimes chaotic setting. I appreciate and I acknowledge the work that you're doing, and I thank you for your dedication. I am Anna Kay. I am one of the behavior support specialists with Albuquerque Public Schools. The objective of our team is to support general education teachers within the Albuquerque Public School system. We do this in a couple different ways. Sometimes we support a teacher and help them use strategies that support maybe one individual student, or maybe it's more whole group classroom management. Just as our teachers are now being asked to transition into virtual classrooms, we are making an effort to also change our approach to a more virtual setting as well. So like I said, this is one of several webinar episodes that will be available to you. At the end of our webinar today, I'll also share some extra information on how to get in contact with us should you need to talk to one of us directly. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my little camera so it doesn't get in the way of our slides. Okay, let's get started. So today we're going to be looking at behavior through the lens of communication and how behavior can be a communication tool. We're also going to be looking at responding to challenging behavior in the online setting in terms of prevention, relationship building, and really addressing those challenging behaviors appropriately. Also taking time to acknowledge that this is challenging work and we need to be patient and show grace to ourselves during this time. This guiding concept comes from a wonderful book called Better Than Carrots or Sticks. This is written by Dominic Smith, Douglas Fisher, and Nancy Frey. This book focuses on restorative practices in both the elementary and secondary settings. We're going to use this quote as a lens to look through when we're thinking about behavior. That is, thinking of students' behavior in the context of communication. Because we know that students are trying to tell us something with their actions that they may not have the words to say, or perhaps they don't feel comfortable saying out loud. When we start to view behavior as communication, we can use the information that the students are sharing with us as a tool to craft a more understanding and effective response. This is a very stressful time for students and adults alike. We find ourselves right now in this place of such uncertainty and chaos. The behavior of many of our students reflects the big emotions that they're feeling. Some of the behavior patterns that we're seeing from students in the online setting are similar to the patterns that they displayed in the traditional classroom. But honestly, a lot of these challenging behaviors are brand new. Which is understandable because this new stress and new emotions that we're all navigating, it's also a brand new environment. And all this newness is sort of a breeding ground for those big emotions and thus oftentimes big challenging behaviors. When we begin to look at challenging behaviors as a form of communication, it can really help us to get to the root cause and begin to solve the problem in a way that preserves the dignity and well-being of all of our students. Now, I want to make it very clear that that repetitive, disruptive, and distracting behavior make online teaching hard. In no way am I suggesting that this isn't difficult. It's incredibly, online teaching in and of itself is difficult. It is more difficult when um, some of our students are displaying this really challenging behavior. And when we're viewing communication or viewing behavior as a communication tool, we are not excusing that inappropriate behavior. By no means are we condoning it or giving kids a free pass. However, by looking at behavior through this lens of communication, it can help with a few things. We can make sure we're responding to the behavior effectively and appropriately. If we're able to find the root cause of the behavior, that is the message that the student is trying to relay to us, if we focus on that root cause rather than just the behavioral outcomes, our response can be much more impactful and long lasting. Also, if we start to view behavior as communication, it can slowly help us to take that behavior less personally as the teachers. And we'll talk about this concept a little further. I'm going to ask you to ask yourself, what is the child either consciously or subconsciously trying to communicate to us? Could it be one of the following? Is the behavior communicating something about the task demand or the workload? Are they telling us this work is too difficult, or I don't have the tools at home to complete this task? Or I don't want my classmates to know that this is hard for me. I would rather that they see me act out. Or I don't know what I'm supposed to do, and I don't want my classmates to see that. Is the behavior communicating something about basic human needs that are not being met? Is this child feeling hungry or scared or tired or lonely? Do they miss the structure and comforts of the school environment? Or are they just overwhelmed with how big these emotions feel right now? And maybe they're not even really able to identify what they're feeling, but they do know it's not a good feeling. Do they miss their friends or their teacher? Is the behavior communicating something around discontentment or fear regarding a student's living environment or the living environment of their peers that they're now just seeing for the first time? Are students communicating to us that they don't want their peers to see what their home life is like? Or some fear that if their teacher does see what their home life is like, CYFD might get involved for the first time or for the second or third time? Is it possible that students are communicating that they can't focus on the instruction because they're distracted by their peers and their living environment? Or is it more that students miss the validation that they used to get from their peers? And so they're making an attempt to get validation in a new way in this new setting. Is the behavior communicating something about the trauma of the current pandemic and how this can be a trigger for feelings of anxiety, depression, or fear from previous trauma? Is the behavior about control or voice during a time when students are lacking any sense of control or voice? In reality, the behaviors that we are seeing are really a complicated combination of several of these messages. In the most dire situations, they're communicating a lot of these messages all at once, which is heavy, I recognize. So viewing behavior as a communication tool, again, does not excuse disruptive or dangerous behavior. It certainly does not make it allowable. However, it can help us as the teacher to separate ourselves from the situation and craft a more well-informed response to the behavior. For example, if I'm beginning to see that my student is looking for validation from their peers in this new online setting, because they used to get that in the more traditional setting, how can I start to incorporate leadership roles for that student into this new setting so they can still get that validation in an appropriate way? Or if my students are communicating that they are just overwhelmed with fear and anxiety, how can I create structured activities that focus on the social and emotional well-being of my students, either as a whole group or maybe in a small group setting or even one-on-one with a student? We'll talk a little bit more about that further. But I do want to direct your attention down to the bottom of this slide. When we're talking about disruptive and dangerous behavior, um, again, it's really important that we separate ourselves from the situation so that we can respond appropriately. I'm sure a lot of you are really familiar with the phrase Q-tip. If you're not, it's your lucky day. We're going to talk about it briefly. I like to lead into this with a story. So a couple years ago, after a really particularly difficult day as a classroom teacher, a colleague of mine shared the old adage of Q-tip, which is quit taking it personally. This colleague reinforced that rarely are students engaging in behavior simply because they're trying to make your life as a teacher more difficult. Now, I understand the support that this colleague was trying to provide, and I agree with this, the sentiment that most often students are not just out to get me as the teacher or to make my life harder or to disregard how hard I worked on that lesson that they totally just hijacked. Rarely is that the driving force behind a student's behavior. However, I'd like to make some space to say that it's really hard not to take it personally. And I understand that. And by sharing Q-tip, I don't want to imply that we can just turn off that feeling of taking things personally. Teaching is one of the most personal careers, really, from a philosophical standpoint, emotionally, financially, et cetera, et cetera. We are personally connected to our craft. And we're not robots, we're humans. So while I understand the Q-tip phrase, I also acknowledge that it's really hard not to take it personally. And that's not a switch we can just make overnight. For me, in my Q-tip journey, if you will, um, it wasn't until I really started looking at behavior as a communication tool that I was finally able to start separating the behavior of the child from myself and my own emotions. Um, and I was able to start taking things less personally so I could really address the behavior appropriately. But in all honesty, that was something that took a very long time for me. It took a lot of conscious effort on my part and a lot of reflective work. So wherever you are on that journey, I recognize that it's hard, and I appreciate your persistence and your own personal journey in how you address the behavior in your classroom. Okay, so we know that the behavior is communicating something. Great. Now what do we do with that? Let's talk a little bit about prevention first. And some of the measures that I'm going to describe here can help to prevent the behavior from starting at all. Now, of course, this isn't a guarantee that there will be no challenging behaviors. That's not really how the world works. Um, However, these can certainly help. It's important that we remember that just because students understood the expectations in our physical classrooms, this does not mean that they know the expectations for this new classroom. I really recommend to teachers as viewing this as a whole new school year, teaching the expectations just as you would during the first few weeks of school in a more traditional setting. And in this, remembering that teaching is not telling, especially in this brand new environment. Teaching is not telling students that they already know how to behave, or just telling them what the expectation is. We know that teaching, just like teaching of content areas, is so much more complicated than that. Equally as complicated, teaching behavior involves a process, right? So when the teacher has opportunity to model the behavior, and then providing space for 2 or 3 students to model the behavior, while the rest of their peers observe, maybe provide feedback. This is a place where you could use your chat bar, or maybe some of those Google Nod extensions, thumbs up or clapping hands. And then the whole group is given the opportunity to practice whatever the specific behavior is. And the teacher provides feedback and reinforcement in the form of behavior-specific praise. And again, just like in teaching content, this is not a one-off. This is going to happen every day and with various behaviors, various expectations that you're trying to teach your students to use. It's an ongoing process. I can't reinforce enough, number 5, making sure that we are providing behavior-specific praise. That's a very strong reinforcer. And when we make a point to acknowledge all the students that are doing their best to demonstrate these expectations, that really goes a long way with enforcing the behavior so that we see it more often, and also building those relationships with our students. Also, as a preventative measure, we want to really take time to focus on the social and emotional support. Now, the CLP, the Continuous Learning Plan, outlines that social emotional support is as important as maintaining academic content skills. Social and emotional support, granted, I'm biased as a behavior support specialist, but I think is one of the foundational aspects, or should be one of the foundational aspects of our teaching practices, especially now that we are in this new online setting. So really making sure that we are providing space to give students time to practice identifying their emotions and choosing appropriate coping skills. Remember, the coping skills that they used in our physical classrooms might not necessarily translate to the home environment. And when we're talking about those coping skills, I really encourage you to ask your students, really probe them for coping skills that they were already using at home, or maybe ideas of integrating new coping skills ideas. Again, creating a safe space through routines and rituals. I think back to a really good friend of mine, Miss Kathy, was talking about the wonderful classroom ritual her first grade class had when someone lost a tooth, and how it was really important for her to generalize that, to translate that into this new virtual setting, because our kiddos are so reliant on routines and rituals. There is safety in that predictability. Also making sure we're providing space for brain breaks and shake breaks. Just like students need both emotional and academic breaks in the physical classroom, in the traditional classroom, they need them now as well. Most of our kiddos are spending a great deal of time just sitting at home. And then when we ask them to sit in front of a computer screen for an hour, that's a big ask. Most of our students that are already kind of wiggly and squirrely and maybe not disruptive, but demonstrating that distractive behavior, they're communicating to us, I really need to move. And the more that we can integrate these brain breaks or shake breaks in a structured format, the more we can kind of pare down some of that wiggly behavior that's distracting to us as teachers and then also to their peers. Another way of doing this is through structured recess. I know a couple of teachers are providing just like a 10-minute break within their hour-long lesson so that kids can have recess and play. The teacher serves as sort of the duty teacher and observes. Some kids talk to each other. Some kids just read books or play quietly in their rooms. Other kids just watch their peers. Some kids get up and stand around and run in circles. This provides, again, that brain break, that shake break. It also provides some time for our students to connect with one another. And this chance for the teacher to observe this behavior is really powerful, especially when we're thinking about trying to figure out what behavior is communicating to us. Watching students when they're kind of left to their own devices in a safe way can really shine a lot of light on the messages behind their behavior. I also ask you to consider the academic workload, considering the weight and volume of the tasks that are being assigned in either the synchronous or asynchronous classroom format. And really asking ourselves, is this a realistic amount of work that students can complete independently? While we want to maintain these academic skills, we want to be careful and cognizant not to overwhelm students and parents amid an already stressful time. Just something to consider. And finally, really making sure that we're preserving those one-on-one connections with students. And actually, we're going to talk about that a little further on the next slide. Relationship building. This is the most important preventative tool that you have as a teacher. Teachers who build relationships with their students based on trust and acceptance, they are more likely to cut down on behaviors in a traditional classroom and in a virtual classroom. There's a great body of research that tells us that if students have a strong relationship with at least one adult, they're able to demonstrate higher levels of resiliency and therefore cope with trauma, crisis, mental health issues, and in turn, right, cope with the stress of the reality of our situation right now. One of the most effective ways to support the social and emotional well-being of children and young adults is by creating time and space to check in with them frequently. I was recently listening to a really wonderful podcast called the Trauma Informed Educators Network, and the host was talking about comparing transactional interactions with engaging interactions, and really making sure when we're doing that relationship building and making those having those interactions with students, that they're not transactional. It's not just, how you doing? Good. Okay. Next student. How are you doing? Good. Okay. Next student. It's engaging interactions where we're really taking time to pause and listen to students, or taking time to share with students information about ourselves. It's really important that students know, even in this time when they are far away from us, that they are deeply cared for and that they are valued and important. And we can only do that if we make sure that we're really having those engaging interactions with students. If possible, I know it's a time crunch and it's a big ask, but it's really important that teachers try to find time to meet with students individually or even in a small advisory group For those students that tend to have challenging behavior in the online setting, I recommend meeting with those kiddos one-on-one, if possible, before the meeting, to check in with those students, to remind them of the expectation, maybe to give them time to practice the expectation. Some of those kiddos are really just yearning for attention. And if you're able to check in with them one-on-one beforehand, you can provide some of that attention. Maybe ask them, hey, can you show me your favorite thing in your room? Or maybe you're going to tell them, ask them, what's one goal that we're going to set for you for this next hour? Let's come up with a goal together. Or for those kiddos that are maybe trying to gain validation from peers, maybe this is a time where you talk about a specific activity, a leadership role that they can have in the Google Meet. Maybe they're the timekeeper or the note taker. Or maybe if this is a kid who's really artistic, you ask them to draw an image that represents what we learned in our lesson today. This is a very, very small, brief look at relationship building. But I really recommend that you check out, we have a whole nother webinar focused on relationship building that's going to go more in depth in this. I really recommend that you take a look at that. So now we've moved from the preventative things that we can do as teachers to addressing the behavior appropriately when it happens. So now we're in the thick of things when the behavior has occurred. If we're thinking about addressing the behavior appropriately, first and foremost, we need to separate our emotions from our response. In the book I referenced earlier, Better Than Carrots and Sticks, they talk about teachers taking time to unwind before we wind up. So when we are feeling those big emotions in response to behavior, we're feeling frustrated or angry perhaps, giving ourselves time to unwind before we respond, to make sure that when we respond, it's appropriate. If we don't take time to unwind, we tend to lash out at students or speak to them using an inappropriate or angry tone. And when we do this, we are unintentionally modeling that type of communication as an acceptable way to talk to others when we're frustrated. I'm sure you can agree that is absolutely not a message that we want to be sending to students. And so it's something as adults that we need to be very careful of. Also, we need to make sure that we are preserving the child's dignity. And a lot of that comes from either speaking to the child separately, or if we do have to address the behavior in the moment, making sure we are doing it calmly. Saving face is particularly important for our older students, and maintaining that self-worth is even more important in times of stress or crisis like we find ourselves in now. So unless the redirection pertains to the entire class, or unless the behavior is dangerous and you need to address it absolutely immediately, I try to recommend as often as possible trying to avoid calling out the individual student in front of the whole group. When we embarrass students, we rob them of their dignity. And when we repeatedly rob students of their dignity, we lose credibility as their teacher, and we damage those relationships that we're working hard to build with them. So as much as possible, try to separate or try to have a separate conference with that student, ideally, again, before the Google Meet or before the classroom meeting or afterwards if necessary. If the behavior maintains, if it is severe, I also recommend asking a parent or a caregiver, an adult in the family, to join in that meeting either before or afterwards so that they're aware of what happened and aware of the plan. and calling your administration in for help as much as possible in these more challenging situations. Also, when we're addressing the behavior appropriately, we want to really focus on using the information that we have through when looking at behavior through that lens of communication. So really trying to find the underlying message and making sure that our response addresses that underlying message. Now, even with the best relationships with students, we most certainly are not omniscient, and it's quite often that we really don't understand the entire underlying message. And so this is where we can really use the relationship that we've built with that student to be more transparent and really have an open conversation with them. Again, I would do this separate from the rest of the group, either before the Google Meet or afterwards. I just wrote up a quick little example that maybe this would be appropriate for a third grader, this would be appropriate for a high schooler. I think it really translates across grade levels. So this example is, Samantha, I'm getting the sense that in the Google Meet lesson today, you felt stressed or angry. Was I reading that correctly? Is that how you were feeling? And then after getting some more information from the student, asking them, what can we do tomorrow to make sure the lesson goes better? Or to make sure that you aren't feeling those same emotions? Because I want you to feel comfortable and be able to learn. And I want your classmates to feel comfortable and be able to learn. The student might be able to tell you what was going on for them. It's possible they might not. But really, again, that transparency in talking about what's really going on behind this behavior, again, is a really good way to address the behavior, the root of the behavior, and build those relationships with students. Also, we want to make sure that when we do address the behavior, especially if it's in front of the whole group, as much as possible, we want to avoid things like, stop it, don't do that, cut it out. Those aren't explicit enough. Or even we want to try to avoid something like, Philip, stop pretending to lick the video camera. It's better if we tell students exactly what we do want them to do. So instead of saying, Philip, stop licking the video camera, it might sound more like, remember friends, when we're in online class, I have to be able to see your faces and your shoulders. Everybody self-check. Look in your little screen. Can you see your face and your shoulder? Give me 2 thumbs up if you can. Awesome. Give yourself a high five or a big clap. Great. And then we get right back to the instruction. This is another important component when we are thinking about addressing the behavior appropriately. We want to make sure that we separate the behavior from the child. So something I often encourage adults to think about, how would you feel if your boss connected your worst day on the job to your overall skill set? We know that we feel safer in workspaces when we know that our mistakes do not define us. We want our students to be academic risk takers. And in order for them to do that, they need to feel safe. And they are better able to feel safe when they know that as teachers, we can separate those bad days or those challenging behaviors from who they are as a human being. We can still reinforce the idea that the behavior did not meet the expectations of the learning environment. We can address that behavior is absolutely unacceptable while still validating the child as a person. So I have 2 examples of that. This is maybe for a secondary setting. So you'll notice I use the name Philip a lot. That's the name of my husband, and I'm really great at correcting his behavior. So that's why I keep using his name. So in this secondary example, we say, Philip, your comments in the chat bar today are not what I'm used to seeing from you. The chat bar is, in this class, is a tool to help us gather our share outs about the project. You will only be allowed to participate with your group if you use the chat bar to ask and answer questions about the project. I need you to help me understand what was happening for you today, and help me, let's work together to come up with a way that we can fix this for tomorrow. An example in the elementary setting might look like this. Philip, I need to talk to you about the noises you were making during the read aloud. I know that you can be a really good listener and a respectful classmate. I want to know what was going on today. How can we fix the interruptions so that you and all your classmates are able to learn tomorrow? So in both of these examples, we reinforce that the behavior was unacceptable, right? But the child or the person is still valued. As you'll notice, I'm going to go back to that. In both of these, we started with something that the child is good at, or something we notice about them, before we correct the behavior. Now, this isn't practical in every correction, but in those relationship building conversations that you're having with students, I encourage you to try to frame them this way as much as possible. Also, both of these examples allowed for the student to have some responsibility and agency in repairing their behavior and preparing for a better day tomorrow. So this is an example of a restorative conversation. And the more that we give students responsibility for changing something in the future, for changing their behavior, the more they start to develop that intrinsic motivation around positive behavior, right? Which is the ultimate goal. That we want students to be more intrinsically motivated to demonstrate positive behavior. This is a really good way to kind of build that skill set along with students. Now, that was a lot. That was a lot to take in. I want to provide some space and some time to remind you and to remind myself and to remind anyone listening that we are all humans. And as humans, we make mistakes. Maybe there were some things in this webinar that you heard today that you thought, oh yeah, I'm already doing that, and that was validating. There might be some things that were new to you, or things that maybe you knew but hadn't tried in a while, and that's okay. Again, we are all kind of on our own journey as educators, our own journey in validating and supporting students and viewing their behavior as communication. And just like students learn from their mistakes, we learn from our mistakes. And it's okay if we make mistakes. I found in my career, I made a lot of mistakes with students. I made a lot of terrible errors in how I communicated with them or how I addressed their behavior. And I found that when I took time to apologize to a student, if I did call out their behavior from a place of frustration or anger, if I apologized for my interaction with them, that really went a long way to build our relationship or repair our relationship. It was also a really wonderful place to model that we mess up and we apologize. And this is a way to model for students how to conduct an appropriate apology. I'm going to ask you to sit with yourself, be kind and patient with yourself. And just as we ask forgiveness from our students when we make mistakes, to also bestow that forgiveness on ourselves as we are trying our best to navigate our educational journey, and especially in this new virtual setting. Wow, that was a lot of information, and that was a really quick and dirty webinar that had a lot of stuff in there. I recognize that we could have gone into each of these slides in far more detail. Um, if you would like to talk to either myself or one of my other BSS counterparts about something from this webinar, or just in general about some specific behavior concerns you're seeing in your traditional or your virtual setting, there's a couple different ways you can contact us. You can reach out to us through Twitter at APS BSS Team. We also post a lot of great resources there. We're fun to follow. I recommend that you follow us. You can email our whole team at bss@aps.edu. I recommend that you visit our website. It's a Google site that we've used to post information about upcoming webinars. And then one day when we get back to our traditional setting, we'll be posting professional developments that we're giving. We also have a lot of really great resources for both caregivers and teachers, links to other articles and websites that you might find useful. If you work in Albuquerque Public Schools and you're a general education teacher, you can also submit a ticket through that link there. It's a Google form. And through that ticket, it will get sent to one of us and we'll reach out to you directly so that we can support you and your classroom in your behavioral and social and emotional journey. Again, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you spending time. And I appreciate all the hard work that you're doing outside of this webinar. It does not go unnoticed, and it is greatly appreciated by myself and the rest of the team. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.